The most dangerous thing about a family lie isn't the person telling it, but the person who pays the price to keep it believable. At our traditional Sunday roast, my father reclined in his high-backed chair with the air of a monarch delivering a final decree and said, "Your brother is the only one in this house who truly knows the meaning of a hard day's labor." The table actually erupted in a rhythmic applause that echoed through the hall. I felt 20 years of being the invisible foundation of this family tighten like a noose around my neck, but my voice remained a calm, steady blade as I spoke. In that case, he certainly won't be needing the $3,800 I transfer to his landlord on the first of every month. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a physical weight pressing the air out of the room. My brother, Julian, froze with his glass of expensive vintage halfway to his mouth, the liquid trembling as if the truth itself had a physical grip on his throat. My mother's hand flew to her necklace, her fingers fumbling with the pearls as she whispered his name like a desperate prayer for the words to be retracted. My father's expression didn't shift into anger first. It transformed into something far more devastating, a slow, agonizing realization that the ground beneath his feet was an illusion. In that one surgical sentence, I hadn't just exposed my brother's failure, I had incinerated the collective fantasy we had all been performing for decades. I wondered, in that fleeting moment of chaos, why I had kept the engine running for so long. Was I trying to purchase a seat at the table, or was I simply afraid of what would happen to the people I loved if I stopped funding their dreams? My name is Silas Thorne. I am in my early 30s, and I am finally ready to exhale the story I have been swallowing since my graduation. But before I pull back the curtain on the fallout, I need to know you are standing here in the silence with me. Please, if you listen these lessons, write the comment down why and also subscribe. Sometimes knowing that a single person is listening to the frequency of your truth is the only thing that prevents a heart from turning into stone. If you have ever been the dependable one, the shadow worker, the one expected to carry the world while everyone else takes the credit, stay with me. This is for the ones who are tired of being the safety net. By Friday afternoon, the high-rise office in Richmond felt draped in that specific, heavy stillness that only descends after a massive crisis has been averted. It is the kind of quiet that feels like a collective holding of breath, a moment where the damage is finally contained and the threat is neutralized. My dual monitors were still glowing with the architecture of our latest victory. My inbox was open, and the email from the CTO sat there like a digital trophy. He had written it himself, direct, formal, and undeniable. He thanked our specialized team for our performance under extreme duress, and specifically cited my name for designing the mitigation layer that intercepted the data breach before a single client's identity could be compromised. I read the words 3 times, not because I needed the ego boost, but because I had been conditioned to trust logs and encrypted confirmations far more than the volatile nature of human emotions. In the debriefing room that followed, there were handshakes and celebratory nods. Someone made a joke about finally being able to sleep without a pager, and my director, Elena, gave me that sharp, appreciative look that managers reserve for their most valuable assets, those who are both brilliant and predictable. I played my part to perfection. I smiled, I gave credit to the team, and I accepted the praise with a practiced humility. But deep inside, I felt that familiar, hollow disconnect. I had just won a real-world battle, one that could be quantified and saved capital and protected lives. Yet I knew with a chilling certainty that by Sunday evening, none of this would translate into currency at my parents' dinner table. On my screen, the security graphs showed the attack attempt spiking into red territory and then flatlining into a clean, safe horizon. Those lines made sense to me. In my profession, effort left an audit trail. In my family, effort was something that dissolved the moment it didn't fit the narrative. When I finally shut down my terminal and exited the building, the sunset was reflecting off the glass towers like a fire that didn't give off any heat. My own residence was a sanctuary of order.
neutral colors, soft lighting, and an absence of chaos. I dropped my briefcase, loosened my tie, and did what I always did on the first Friday of the month. I opened my banking portal. The notification was already there, hovering like a ghost in the machine. Transfer status, pending, Harbor Heights Management, $3,800. I stared at that number on the screen. It felt like an old, dull ache in a bone that had been broken and never quite set properly. In the beginning, it was supposed to be a bridge, a temporary lifeline until Julian's revolutionary logistics startup found its feeding. Then it became a habit. Eventually, it became a silent tax I paid to maintain the image of a functional family. I never told a soul, not because I was proud, but because naming the sacrifice would have forced me to explain why I continued to allow myself to be exploited. I told myself I was the one who could handle it. I told myself that family was a collective effort. What I didn't want to admit was how the obligation had slowly coiled around my neck, turning a choice into a prison. My phone vibrated in my palm while I was still staring at the screen. It was my mother. She didn't bother with small talk. "Sunday at the Charleston house, Silas. 6 sharp. Don't be late." The tone was warm, but it carried the structural weight of a command. My father took the phone for a brief second, asking how my computer maintenance job was going in the most dismissive way imaginable, before handing it back as if my life's work was a minor hobby that required no further investigation. My mother added, as if it were a casual afterthought, that Julian would be joining us. He had new stories of success. He always did. I said I would be there because I always was, reliable, punctual, and ready to play the supporting character in someone else's play. A few minutes later, Julian's text arrived. He had been downsized again. Toxic environment, he claimed. Jealous leadership. It was never his lack of discipline. 2 lines later, the tone shifted to a manic optimism. Something grand was on the horizon, a partnership, a true breakthrough. Then came the subtext he never had to articulate. "The rent is due on the 1st, brother." I didn't answer. The silence was the only piece of my dignity I still owned. That night, as the humidity of Virginia pressed against my windows, memories of our childhood in the Charleston estate surfaced without my permission. I saw Julian at the center of every room, a creature of light and effortless charm. I saw myself at the periphery, learning at a very young age that being competent was the fastest way to become invisible. At my college graduation, my father had spent the entire evening regaling guests with Julian's latest visionary idea, while I stood on the porch with my honors degree in my hand, smiling for the camera, because that is what is expected of the child who doesn't cause problems.
I reopened the banking app and noticed a detail that had previously escaped my notice. The recipient's account name on the transfer wasn't the building management company anymore. It had changed to a private holding name, subtle, discreet, and tucked away in a different bank. It was a discrepancy that only someone trained in forensic data would catch. I sat in the darkness for a long time and made a quiet, final decision. This weekend, I wouldn't be the one to fill the gaps. I would simply watch the clock run out. Saturday morning, I drove south toward the coast, the windows down to let the salt air scrub the city out of my lungs. The highway usually calmed me, but today it felt like a fuse was burning. As I crossed into the historic districts of Charleston, the ancient oaks draped in moss seemed to reach out like hands from the past. I remembered the specific phone call that had started this 3-year cycle. Julian's voice had been trembling, telling me he was 48 hours away from being evicted, swearing on our family legacy that it was a momentary lapse in judgment. I had pulled over that day and sent the funds without a second thought, convinced that a few months of support was my duty. 3 years later, I was still paying the premium on a future that was never going to manifest. I wondered why I had never had the courage to tell my parents. Julian had begged me to keep it a secret, claiming it would shatter my father's health to know his golden son was failing. I told myself I was protecting them, but the uglier truth was that I was afraid they would believe Julian's excuses anyway. I was terrified that if I spoke up, I would be cast as the jealous sibling, the one who couldn't handle his brother's potential. I had spent my life hoping they would eventually notice the truth on their own. I just didn't realize that they were intentionally blind. When I pulled into the gravel drive, Julian's silver convertible was already parked dead center, a statement of unearned status. My father and mother were on the veranda, laughing with a vitality that only Julian could inspire in them. No one asked about my drive. I stepped over the threshold and felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the family roles slide back into place. Julian looked radiant, wearing a timepiece that probably cost 3 months of the rent I was currently paying. He spoke of international mergers and high-stakes venture capital, gesturing with the same hands that had been texting me about his impending ruin less than 48 hours ago. My mother hung on every syllable. My father listened with a pride so intense it was almost painful to witness. No one asked for the details. In the kitchen, Julian's phone buzzed incessantly. He glanced at the screen, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his eyes before he silenced it and regained his composure. I asked him, casually, if everything was under control. "Just some clerical errors at the office," he muttered, loud enough for our mother to hear. "The landlord is being a bit of a shark about the new lease terms." My mother immediately rushed to his side, lamenting how the world had become so hostile toward young visionaries. My father added a comment about the inherent superiority of property ownership, and the irony of the statement hung in the air like a thick, poisonous fog that no one else could smell. Later that evening, while Julian was outside taking an urgent call, I sat in the study and scrolled through my records. I took screenshots of every single transfer from the last 36 months. I didn't want to use them as a weapon. I just needed them to exist in a space where they couldn't be denied. While I was searching, I saw a folder reflected in the glass of Julian's laptop, which he had left open on the mahogany desk. It was a PDF from the Harbor Heights Management Office, bold red lettering at the top. Final notice of eviction. I didn't need to read the fine print. I knew the architecture of that lie. That night, lying in the silence of my childhood room, I listened to the old house groan under the weight of its own history. For the first time, I admitted the truth to my own reflection. If my father tried to diminish my existence tomorrow, I would not absorb the blow. I would not smooth over the rough edges of the conflict to keep the peace. I would not fund the illusion for one more second. I had spent a lifetime being the quiet solution to everyone else's catastrophes. Tomorrow, I would let the catastrophe happen. Saturday morning in Charleston always moved with a deliberate, performative grace. The light through the kitchen windows was filtered by the magnolias, and my mother was already halfway through the preparation of a meal that was more of a ceremony than a dinner. My father spent the morning walking the grounds, discussing property taxes and local politics with a neighbor, the kind of conversation designed to broadcast stability to the rest of the world. Julian was the perfect son. He laughed at all the right intervals, offered to help with the heavy lifting, and carried himself with the effortless confidence of a man who had earned his place at the summit. Watching him, I finally understood why people believed the stories he told. He didn't just lie, he inhabited the character of a successful man so completely that the truth felt like the intruder. I remained in the background, a ghost in my own home. When my father finally directed a question toward my career, it was broad and shallow, the way one might ask about a distant relative they don't particularly like. I tried to explain the security architecture I had implemented, keeping the technical details to a minimum. He nodded, but I could see his eyes glazing over. He summarized months of high-level engineering as software stuff and concluded with, "Well, at least it pays the bills for now." Julian jumped in with a condescending smirk, calling me a digital librarian, in a tone that made my expertise sound like a charming but ultimately useless hobby. No one meant any harm in that moment. That was the most devastating part of the dynamic. It was just the natural order of the Torn family.
By noon, the stage was set. The heirloom china was out. The lace tablecloth was smooth with a precision that bordered on the religious. My mother adjusted the silver until it was perfectly aligned. Julian told an elaborate story about a networking event in the city, dropping the names of governors and CEOs like they were childhood friends, describing a future executive position that sounded just plausible enough to quiet any real questions. My father leaned in, his face glowing with a reflected glory. I could feel my composure thinning, not because I was jealous of the attention, but because I was exhausted by the energy required to stay neutral. The breaking point arrived with the suddenness of a lightning strike. Julian's phone rang, and he stepped into the pantry to answer it. I happened to be passing by to grab a glass of water, and I caught the low, jagged edge of his voice. Words cut through the ambient noise of the kitchen. Guarantor status, he's already paid, don't you dare call my parents. I stopped dead in my tracks, the cold glass of water sweating in my hand. My pulse slowed to a heavy, deliberate thud. This wasn't just about a rent check anymore. This was about my legal identity being used as a shield for his deception. I didn't confront him in the pantry. I knew the script too well. My mother would make excuses. My father would demand I stop causing a scene. The truth would be buried before it could even gasp for air. Instead, I went back to the table and waited, filing the information away like evidence in a courtroom. Before we took our seats, I checked my banking app one last time. The screenshots were there, a digital paper trail of every dollar I had sacrificed. I told myself that if the meal remained civil, I would leave the truth in my pocket, but if I was pushed one more time, I would let the dam break. When we finally sat down, the scene was a portrait of traditional perfection. The light caught the crystal, and Julian launched into another anecdote about his investors. My father leaned forward, completely captivated by the performance. I gripped my phone under the table, the sharp edge of the case pressing into my palm. My father cleared his throat, adopting the posture of a man about to deliver a sermon. He began a lecture on the decline of the modern work ethic, about how the current generation lacked the fortitude to build a legacy. Julian nodded in solemn, sycophantic agreement. I knew exactly what was coming. I could see the sentence forming in my father's mind, and I knew that once it was spoken aloud, there would be no way to mend the fracture. The room fell into that strange, heavy stillness that precedes an irreversible event. My father's voice carried the authority of 30 years of believing he was right as he looked around the table and said, "Julian is the only one in this family who truly understands what it means to work for a living." The words landed with the weight of a physical blow. Someone at the table laughed and tapped the wood in agreement. My mother gave a supportive nod, an automatic response born of decades of habit. I set my fork down with a quiet, terrifying precision. My voice was steady, devoid of the rage that was screaming in my chest. I said, if Julian is such a pillar of the workforce, then he certainly won't be needing the $3,800 I've been paying for his luxury apartment every month for the last 3 years. For a heartbeat, the rotation of the earth seemed to stop. Then Julian choked on his drink, a violent, wet sound as he struggled to breathe. My mother whispered his name as if she could pull him back from a ledge. My father stared at me, his eyes narrowing into cold slits, and demanded to know what kind of nonsense I was speaking. Julian recovered enough to laugh, a high, frantic, desperate sound, and said I was being dramatic, that I had helped him out with a small loan a long time ago. I looked my father directly in the eye and listed the facts without an ounce of emotion. Every month, 36 months, the same date, the same amount, including the transfer I had just verified on my phone. I placed the device on the table and slid it across the white lace. The screen was a litany of evidence. No commentary, just the cold architecture of the truth. My father picked up the phone with hands that were suddenly trembling. My mother leaned over his shoulder, her hand covering her mouth as if to keep a scream from escaping. Julian tried to pivot, claiming the money was a consultation fee for connections he had provided to my firm. I asked him, with a surgical calm, why a consultation fee would match the exact line item of a Harbor Heights lease agreement. I described the building, the rooftop lounge, the private valet, the lifestyle he was enjoying while I worked 80-hour weeks to pay for it. The lie could not survive the collision with basic mathematics. My father's anger suddenly swiveled towards me, accusing me of being secretive, of letting this fester for so long. I told him I knew exactly how this family operated, that if I had spoken sooner, I would have been labeled the villain, and Julian would have been protected once again. As Julian shifted in his chair, a folded piece of paper slipped from his designer blazer and landed on the floor.
I picked it up before he could move. It was the eviction notice I had seen earlier, but there was a new detail on the back. A handwritten note regarding the primary guarantor, followed by my social security number and my office phone number. My stomach turned. This wasn't just a secret, it was a crime. Julian stood up, his voice cracking as he accused me of trying to destroy his reputation. I told him the money was over, the silence was over. He looked at me with a hatred that was pure and unfiltered, grabbed his keys, and stormed out of the house. The front door slammed so hard that the family portraits in the hallway rattled on their hooks. The house went silent again, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a demolition site. I stayed in my chair, my hands perfectly still, knowing with absolute certainty that the dinner was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. After the sound of Julian's engine faded into the distance, the dining room felt like a tomb. My mother remained frozen, her gaze fixed on the empty doorway, as if she could pull her favorite son back into the room through sheer force of will. My father stood at the head of the table, his knuckles white as he gripped the chair, his jaw set in a way that signaled he was searching for a way to make this my fault. I didn't move. I didn't apologize for ruining the evening. I sat there because for the first time in my life, I refused to be the one to clean up the mess someone else had made. My father's first words were an attack. He said family matters should be handled privately, that I had been low to bring up financial records at the dinner table, and that I was being unnecessarily harsh to my brother during a transition period. I told him, with a clarity that felt like ice in my veins, that he was the one who made my life a public judgment when he used his position to insult my worth in front of the entire family. I reminded him that I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't used an epithet, and I hadn't exaggerated a single cent. I had simply introduced the truth into a room that was overflowing with fiction. The atmosphere shifted from anger to something far more uncomfortable. My mother began to weep, a quiet, rhythmic sob she always used to terminate any conversation that required accountability. She said Julian was sensitive, that he couldn't handle the harsh realities of the world like I could, and cutting him off without warning was an act of cruelty. I told her that by protecting him, she had ensured he would never become a man. I told her I had been his silent partner for 3 years, and all it did was teach him how to be a more efficient predator. Saying it out loud felt like shedding a weight I didn't know I was carrying.
I went upstairs to my childhood room to pack, needing to leave before the bargaining and the gaslighting began. My phone began to vibrate incessantly. Julian's name appeared on the screen over and over. The messages were a psychological map of his desperation. First, he cursed me for humiliating him. Then he pleaded for just one more month to straighten things out. Then he accused me of being the reason his life was a failure. I didn't reply. I knew that any engagement was just a door I was leaving open for him to walk through and take more of my life. While I was sitting on the edge of the bed, I looked closer at my banking history. I saw notes he had attached to the incoming transfers on his end, labels like seed funding and revenue share. He hadn't just taken the money. He had used the transfers to build a fraudulent record of success for his own ego. Around midnight, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from a man who identified himself as the director of Harbor Heights. He was professional but firm, asking for an immediate verification regarding the lease renewal I was supposedly guaranteeing. He mentioned since my name was listed as the primary financial contact, he expected a resolution by the following morning. My blood ran cold. Julian hadn't just told them I would pay. He had forged my signature on a legal document to secure his luxury lifestyle. I left Charleston before the sun came up. The drive back to Richmond felt different. It was mechanical, focused, and entirely devoid of the usual guilt. I was in incident response mode. I decided on 2 things before I reached the city limits. I would secure my legal identity, and I would not speak to a single member of my family until the facts were documented by a professional. When I reached my office on Monday, I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. I sat through meetings,
I analyzed data, I did my job. But the illusion was shattered when the lobby security paged my desk. A man named Julian Thorne was in the foyer, demanding to see me. Seeing him in my professional space was the final transgression. This was the one area of my life that I had kept clean, untouched by the chaos of the Thorne family dynamic. I went down to the lobby and met him near the glass entrance. He looked like a man who was drowning. He was frantic, telling me that the management company was going to lock his doors today if the transfer didn't clear. I told him, quietly and slowly, that I was done. I offered to help him find a modest studio he could actually afford. I offered to help him refine his resume, but I would not give him another penny. He laughed, a bitter, hollow laugh, and asked if I wanted him to be a nobody. I told him he already was a nobody, not because he lacked money, but because he lacked a soul. That afternoon, the real work of reconstruction began. I contacted the management office at Harbor Heights. I informed them in a formal letter that I had never signed a guarantor agreement, that my personal data had been used without my authorization, and that any prior payments were voluntary gifts that were now terminated. The manager responded with a digital copy of the lease. The signature was a crude, desperate imitation of my handwriting, but my social security number and my work credentials were terrifyingly accurate. My brother had stolen my identity to buy himself a view of the harbor. By Tuesday, I had to sit down with my firm's legal team. It was one of the most humiliating conversations of my life. They were concerned about the security risks of having an immediate family member who was willing to commit identity fraud against a lead engineer. I realized then that Julian's desperation hadn't just touched my bank account. It was threatening the career my father claimed was just software stuff. My parents called me that night in a coordinated effort. My father told me I was being too litigious, and my mother begged me for one last act of mercy. I realized that in the Thorne family, crisis was the only currency they understood. The louder Julian failed, the more they expected me to sacrifice to keep the silence. By refusing to pay, I had become the villain of their story. I sent a final, formal message to Julian. I told him to remove my name from every account, every utility bill, and every emergency contact list immediately. I told him that if I saw a single unauthorized inquiry on my credit report, I would file a formal police report for identity theft. I didn't want to do it, but I knew that with a person like Julian, a boundary without a consequence is just a suggestion. We met one last time at a quiet diner on the edge of town. He looked like a ghost of the man he had been at Sunday dinner. He tried to tell me he did it for the family name so we wouldn't look weak. I told him the only thing that made us look weak was the lie. I made him log into his portals right there and remove my data. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely type. I could hear my father on the other end of Julian's phone, still trying to broker a peace. I took the phone and told my father that if he wanted Julian to stay in that apartment so badly, he could sign the guarantor form himself. My father went silent. He never signed. The resolution didn't come with a flourish or a celebratory toast. It came through months of quiet, grueling accountability. Harbor Heights eventually cleared my record after I provided a mountain of evidence regarding the fraudulent entries. Julian was forced to move into a tiny one-bedroom basement apartment and trade his convertible for a vehicle that was 10 years old and smelled of stale coffee. He actually had to take a job at a local shipping firm, manual labor, hourly pay, zero prestige. For the first 6 months, he didn't speak a word to me. My parents changed in the silence. My mother stopped hosting the elaborate Sunday roasts, finding that without the golden child narrative, the house felt too large and too quiet. My father eventually reached out, not with a grand apology, but with a humble admission. He told me he hadn't realized how much weight I was carrying because I made it look so effortless. He admitted that he valued the presentation of success more than the character of the man behind it. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was the first time in 30 years that he had actually seen me. Today, the Thorne family is different. We are not a Hallmark card. Julian still struggles with his resentment, and my parents still have their moments of enabling him, but the roles have been permanently altered. I am no longer the invisible bank. My name belongs to me again. I realized that my greatest fear, that the truth would destroy my family, was a lie in itself. The lie was the thing that was poisoning us. The truth was the only thing that could actually save us from each other. As you walk away from this story, I want you to take a hard look at the peace you are maintaining in your own life. We often spend our best years trying to earn the love of people who are only capable of loving the version of us that serves them. We tell ourselves that being the strong one is a virtue, but often it's just a prison we built for ourselves out of a fear of being alone. Your peace is not a debt you owe to anyone else's comfort. Setting a boundary is not a betrayal, it's an act of self-preservation. If the relationships in your life require you to remain silent about the truth of who you are and what you do, then those aren't relationships, they are transactions. I chose to stop paying, and for the first time in my life, I finally know what it feels like to be free.